Janet Gardner provides a lot of good tips for thinking about argumentative thesis statements in reading and writing about literature. When teaching students about thesis statements in an argumentative paper, I also like to give them the following model for understanding how to build a thesis. Don't think of this as different from what Gardner says about thesis statements, so much as a different way of considering some of the same ideas. The model I ask students to consider when building thesis statements is a house with more than one floor. Thinking of the components of a thesis as floors in a building is one helpful way of describing what makes up a good thesis. Here's how it breaks down. The first floor of a thesis describes the topic. It gives the facts. It makes an observation. This level of the thesis makes observations that are non-controversial. That is, no reasonable person would disagree with them. A person reading such a thesis immediately thinks, yes, this is true. To create an argumentative, debatable thesis statement, though, you need to add a second floor to the thesis you're building. So what does that second floor look like? Well, a second floor thesis interprets. It gives a point of view on and or adds controversy to the facts of the first floor. By adding controversy, I mean it takes a position on the facts that's not obvious, a position that a reasonable person could disagree with. A person reading a two-floor thesis thinks, that's an interesting point of view. Now prove it to me. Here's an example of how you might build a thesis statement using Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. In this case, the first floor might be something like, Gilman often depicts the narrator of The Yellow Wallpaper as childish. As you can see, this first floor isn't really controversial. Most people who have read the story would agree that there are a number of moments where the narrator is described as acting childish or being treated childishly. Here's a possibility of how you might add a second floor to this thesis statement in order to make it more debatable. Gilman depicts the Yellow Wallpaper's narrator as childish in order to show how her medical treatment forces her to regress rather than move forward and take control of her life. Now, with a second floor like this added to your thesis, you're taking a stand on why Gilman might depict the narrator as childish, something which is debatable. You're presenting an interpretation, in other words, of what the meaning is of all this childish behavior in the story, an interpretation that you'll now have to prove with evidence from the text. In terms of Essay 1, this would mean that you can't stop with observing that the doctor uses negative terms to describe the kids, short sentences, and lots of questions. These are interesting facts, but if you did this, I'd then ask you what that reveals about him as a character or tells us about his feelings toward the kids. Similarly, you couldn't stop with saying that William Carlos Williams shows the awful environment of the children's ward in this hospital. While that's true, if you started with that as your first floor, I'd then ask you why he does this. What is William Carlos Williams trying to show us about the medical profession or about doctors in depicting this awful environment? As your writing becomes more sophisticated, you may sometimes add another floor, a third floor to your thesis as well, something that ties your interpretation to a bigger picture than just the text itself. But for right now, if you achieve a solid two-floor thesis in your first essay, you will be in really good shape.